Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie, and welcome once again to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Today, house prices. We often hear that the reason house prices are so high is because there isn't enough supply. So fix the supply issue and houses will suddenly become affordable. But is that the case? Does supply have any influence on the prices we pay for our houses? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Now, this might shock you if you're not used to Australian house prices. A narrow, fairly run-down two-bedroom terrace in Paddington in Sydney's eastern suburbs sold last week for $1.5 million. And that was seen as being a bit of a bargain. Just down the road, a four-bedroom terrace sold for $2.7 million. Over £1.5 million, that is, for a terraced house on 152 square metres of land. Basically, a small paved courtyard for a garden. £1.5 million. That's just 18 times the average wage for a terraced house. Now, Paddington is in a city, so let's travel to the far north of Sydney, to Wahroonga. Half an hour by train, a one-bedroom unit sold for just $660,000. That's more like it. It is on a very busy road, but hey, it's only 8.5 times the average wage for a one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. In fact, one of the reasons my family moved out of Sydney was because we just found that Sydney was too expensive. And one of the reasons given is that housing supply has just not kept pace with demand. So, Steve, I mean, there's a tendency, isn't there, when we look at housing, to treat it like any other product. So if prices rise, it's because there's not enough supply. So is there any truth in that argument?
Well, it's not so much the supply side that I find frustrating and how people think about the housing market. It's the demand side, but I'll just to talk about the supply side.
But you see why I'm raising this, because invariably this is what politicians and a lot of people say. Oh, it's because there's not enough houses. If we can just have more houses, prices will go down.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is that when politicians say that, the last thing they'll ever do is build public housing. Yeah. The one thing they could actually do is public housing. They say, well, there's not enough supply. Okay, why don't you create some public housing? Oh, can't do that. That would interfere with the market. But guys, the market is not working, even according to you. Oh, we can't interfere with it, though. Well, what the hell are you doing in politics then? So, this is one of the little. Nobody seems to ask them out on the media. I'd like to see a journalist actually ask one of these politicians who whinges about supply being the problem.
Yeah.
Because what they always say is, one of the reasons they say supply is a problem, it's simple. It's somebody else's problem.
But you can see why it's an easy sell, because I've been to auctions in Australia and I've seen the hunger from people bidding, desperate to secure a house. And, you do stand around and think, well, if only there was more houses in this neighbourhood, maybe things would be a little less ferocious.
Well, that's not the real problem. That's not the real problem with the housing market as much as what's the demand. And because the demand, like for example, if I told you the price of carrots is going to rise tomorrow, would you go out and buy more carrots?
No.
Exactly. No. If I told you houses are going to rise tomorrow, would you buy more houses?
Yeah, well, maybe I wouldn't. That is fundamentally the problem, isn't it?
That is fundamentally the problem. Okay, we have it's one of the two fundamental issues, the problem on the demand side of housing. People will go out and buy a house because they expect the price to rise. Yeah. And nobody goes and buys carrots because they expect the house to rise. A couple of reasons for that. One is you can substitute something else apart from carrots. It's rather hard not to live in a house. You can substitute an apartment for in a house, but you can't substitute a shoebox in the middle of the road for a house unless you're in a Monty Python comedy skit. So it's the lack of substitutability of the product itself. You've got to buy housing, and then it's being treated both as an asset and as something which, even to live in, if you don't secure it now, it'll be more expensive in the future. That expectation is built into the experience we've had in the last 40 or 50 years. But in fact, if you'd been in Holland, I'm only guessing the actual years now. I'll see if I can look it up while we talk. But if you'd been in Holland between, say, 1810 and 1860, you would have said, you're mad to buy a house today. Wait a month, it'll be cheaper, because houses because that time period fell. Yeah. In real terms. And there's long-term, very, very long-term data in a wonderful thing called the Herrengrach Canal Index. And I'll type in my browser. I'll probably be able to find it on the web.
While you're doing that, while you're coming up with those figures, I mean, in theory, if prices rise for anything, you'd expect that supply would increase. If prices rise, people say, oh, there's an opportunity to make money here. Let's produce more of widget A, or let's sell more houses. If people are prepared to pay more, you'd expect production would increase. If there was, except for the fact that there's a limit to the land available, surely that would happen. So why doesn't that happen with housing?
There's at least two reasons why it won't happen. One is that houses take a lot longer to build, though that actually implies there'll be some extremely exciting stuff happening as we start getting into 3D printing of houses, and that's like you can print a house in a day with 3D technology. So that could be a lot of fun in terms of upsetting a particular apple cart. But the other is the location of housing, and this is something which, in a sense, you can make a Ricardian type analysis, because if you live in the centre of a very, very small town, let's call it Londinium, and Londinium grows and grows and grows, and it gets to be enormously expensive to commute from the periphery of Londinium to the centre. And there are train lines being built around as well, which you didn't build, of course, but they just happen to be built by the state to make it possible to get around. You benefit from all that.
Yeah.
So the locational aspect of land itself makes it extremely difficult to...
So governments don't help here either, do they? So, for example, you hear the argument in places like Sydney, for example, which is, I think, worse than London. If you don't work, if you're not living and working in Sydney, then or similarly in Melbourne, then you haven't really got an opportunity to work anywhere else, because although the trains are cheaper, they're also incredibly slow, and there's congestion on the roads, or the roads just don't exist. So if you work in London, if you work in Sydney, you've got to live in Sydney in effect. So that puts the pressure on the house prices. There's no government policy to say, well, okay, let's look at some sort of regional distribution of jobs. I guess because that, again, would be interfering with the markets.
Well, it's a common. If the market's not working, you interfere with it. Okay,
yeah.
That should be the bottom line of the way people think about it. Of course, they don't. But one of the problems about the whole idea that you can actually create a new regional centre and make that work effectively is that part of where our industrial and economic growth has come from is by aggregations of peoples in cities.
Yeah.
And once a city gets a certain, the cities. This one is actually a very interesting book called Scale that I recommend people take a look at, to talk about the number of mathematical regularities you can find both in human society and biological growth and so on. And he points out that the author of the book points out that firms normally die within the maximum lifespan for a firm is something of the order of half a century, maybe a century at best. So if the corporations just are born and die over time, that's one of the regularities you find in the data. Cities are not born and die over time. They are born and they continue growing.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, to find out, you have to listen to the full version of this interview, and to do that, you need to become a subscriber to the Debunking Economics podcast, either by visiting debunkingeconomics.com and picking one of the subscription plans on the right-hand side, or becoming a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Pay $10 or more per month and you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. And in the rest of this podcast, we look at things like external costs, who's paying for the pollution, the infrastructure, the congestion costs whenever a new home is built, and what about our appetite for bigger houses? Is expectation also part of the problem, as well as more on the issue of geography? Why aren't we simply moving somewhere more affordable? Hear that in the full version of this podcast. Hope to see you back here for that. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.